When Muhammad al-Fatih had passed away, he had made the Ottoman Empire the most preeminent state in Europe and perhaps the world, thanks to his policies of expansionism and state building. But when he died, he left two sons behind. One was called Jem. He was 700 kilometers away, governing the southern province of Konya, and the second was called Bayezid, who was 680 kilometers away, ruling the eastern province of Amasya. What ensued next was a race to the palace to see who could get here first and be the next ruler from the house of Osman. While that was happening, there was very interesting events taking place between the other institutions of power in the Ottoman Empire within the palace, and these events would have a huge ramification on who would actually win the race. Bayezid was a very soft-centered man, very different from his father Muhammad al-Fatih from the military point of view, and the Balkan-based Janissaries had been pushed very hard by Bayezid's father and wanted a rest, so they favoured Bayezid. The Grand Vizier at the time was Turkish, and he wanted to counter the power of the Balkan-based Janissaries by favouring Jem. The problem for him was Jem was very much in the mould of his father Muhammad al-Fatih. Therefore, the Balkan-based Janissaries decided to kill the Grand Vizier and replace him with the Grand Vizier from the Balkans. First to arrive here 19 days after the death of Muhammad al-Fatih in 1481 was Bayezid, and all had been prepared for him to ascend smoothly to the throne, and he was completely unaware of everything. What this shows is that the Sultan did not have absolute power. Other institutions within the Ottoman Empire also had power, and they also had their vested interests, and they used that power for their vested interests. And it was the Janissaries who'd shown that they were the most prominent out of all these other institutions, and this makes sense because Muhammad al-Fatih had heavily favoured the Balkans during his reign. During Bayezid's rule, there was no major battles like what had occurred in the rules of all his predecessors, but as this is politics, you will have some minor skirmishes here and there, and one particular one that he had was a sea campaign. He expanded his navy to try and deal with the economic and maritime threats known as the Venetians, who were more merchant Catholics than Catholic merchants, and he engaged with them in the Aegean and managed to capture a few Aegean islands from them. This made the Venetians realize that it'd be better to sign a peace treaty with Bayezid and trade with the Ottomans rather than go to war with the Ottomans, which would be way too expensive. So Bayezid's diplomatic skills really helped him out, and his rule was really one of peace and prosperity. However, having subdued a sea power in the west, he'd completely taken his eye off a land power in the east, and this would lead to his downfall in the most ironic of circumstances. Bayezid II's father Muhammad al-Fatih had done a lot of conquering, and he had brought the empire into contact with three major players: the Hungarians to the north, the Safavids to the east, and the Mamluks to the south. If Bayezid was to enact aggressive campaigns against these three, it would have been a disaster, and it wasn't in his nature anyway. So his rule is really a rule of consolidation, consolidating the conquest of his father Muhammad al-Fatih. Early on in his rule in 1492, an interesting event happened at the other side of the Mediterranean in Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain. The last Muslim kingdom had fallen to the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, and the first thing they did was expel the Jews from Spain. Bayezid sent his ships over to take these Jewish refugees and bring them to his land, Constantinople, Thessalonica, and settle them here, which really does show the attitude of the Ottoman Empire to non-Muslim subjects in and outside of the empire. Of note, these people that came across, it wasn't only Jews. 200,000 Muslims decided they wanted to leave Spain as well. Many of them ended up here in Constantinople, in the Galata region, where Bayezid granted them some land where they built a mosque for themselves. This mosque, which is known in Turkish as Arab Jami, which means Arab mosque. Bayezid had two sons. One was called Selim and one was called Ahmed. As for Selim, he was governing in the northeastern province of Trabzon, and because of that, he was very well aware of what Shah Ismail was accomplishing in the lands to the east. He had recently conquered most of the Persian territories, and he was causing internal problems for the Ottomans. The Shah's Safavid Empire emphasized Shia Islam as opposed to the Sunni Islam emphasized by the Ottomans, and they also emphasized Persian culture as opposed to the multiculturalism of the Ottomans. The Shah's elite fighting force was called the Kizilbash, which means the red turbans, and they were Turkic. And the Shah himself was of mixed ancestry, but he had a bit of Turkic in him as well. And the Shah knew that the Turks of Anatolia did not like the centralizing activity, the centralizing policies of the Ottomans, and that they didn't like the fact that the Ottomans were also favoring the Balkans now. He also knew that not so far in recent history, the Turkic Beyliks in Anatolia actually allied with another ruler from the East, Timur. So for that reason, he sent in his Shia preachers into Anatolia, not only to spread Shiaism, but also to become loyal to him and rebel against the Ottomans. And some Turkic Beyliks did. This rebellion was called the Sağkulu Rebellion, and Sağkulu means slave of the Shah. Selim was a young man, one of the younger brothers, so he was unlikely to succeed. But he thought he would use these circumstances to try and depose his father and live long as a sultan rather than die young as a prince. Selim did rebel against his father and he marched on Constantinople. And when he got there, he found that he had the support of the Janissaries. It had been nearly 30 years since Muhammad al-Fatih had undergone aggressive military campaigns, so by now they'd had enough rest, and they'd also been convinced of Selim's narrative of the Safavid threat, and they preferred to have Selim, a military man, rather than Bayezid, who was very soft-hearted and very old. He also had the support of the ulama, because the ulama could see that the Shah in Iran or Persia was promoting Shiaism and also Persian culture, which was very different to the Ottoman ideology, but also he'd encouraged rebellions inside Ottoman lands. So they thought that there was a threat to Din and Devlet, the two entities which are symbiotic and need each other to be implemented at the same time together for either one of them to be successful. So they issued a fatwa in support of Selim, allowing him to depose his father Bayezid from power. Ironically, it was these institutions of power which brought Bayezid to power 20 years earlier, when he was galloping on his horse from the east to Constantinople against his brother. 20 years later, the same institutions remove him from power. Whenever you're ruling such a big empire, you're always going to have a few blind spots here and there. But in this case, Bayezid was blindsided by his own son, Selim.